The Wyoming plains stretched endlessly in both directions, flat and wind-scoured like a forgotten postcard from another time. Faded fence posts leaned sideways along the two-lane highway, and not a single vehicle had passed for what felt like hours. The wind had a bite to it, even though spring was officially on the calendar. Out here, that meant cold mornings, leftover patches of snow, and skies so wide they made you feel like an ant beneath God's microscope. Travis Hale drove with one hand on the steering wheel of his rusted '94 Chevy Silverado, the other lazily hanging out the window. His flannel jacket was buttoned crooked over a white t-shirt that had seen better days, and a ball cap that read Fremont County Rodeo 2002 sat low over his brow. He hummed along to an old Alan Jackson tune playing just above the volume of the engine's occasional sputter. He wasn't in any particular hurry. Tuesdays didn't bring much excitement in a place like Pine Hollow, Wyoming, population 643 if you counted the Miller twins' new baby. The town sat tucked between cattle pastures and long stretches of nowhere, about 100 miles from the nearest Walmart and a good 3 hours from anything that could be called a city. Travis glanced at the dashboard clock, 3:27 p.m. He'd finished his last oil change around noon, then spent the rest of the afternoon replacing the leaky faucet in his shop's bathroom, not because it had to be fixed, but because he couldn't think of anything else to do. Life was like that lately. He reached for the styrofoam cup of coffee resting in the console and took a sip. It had gone cold. He grimaced but didn't throw it out the window. He hated litter more than cold coffee. Up ahead, the long ribbon of road shimmered in the sun. Heat waves danced off the blacktop, though the temperature wasn't much over 45 degrees. A pair of vultures circled lazily in the distance, nothing unusual in these parts. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Travis spotted something off. Just beyond the shoulder, close to the fence line, a small shape limped across the gravel. He slowed down instinctively, squinting through the windshield. "Coyote," he muttered, but something didn't sit right. It was too small, and it wasn't running. Just dragging itself forward in a jerky, uneven line. The truck rolled to a stop. Travis leaned forward, trying to make out what he was looking at. He didn't know it yet, but this moment, this tiny, broken figure on the side of the road, was about to change everything. Travis put the truck in park and let the engine idle. The shape was closer now, definitely not a coyote. It was too low to the ground, too unsteady. He opened the door, the cold wind hitting his face like a slap, and stepped down onto the gravel shoulder. The breeze carried the dry scent of sagebrush and sunbaked dirt, but underneath it was something else, faint, metallic, like rust and old pennies. He took a few slow steps forward, boots crunching over loose gravel. That's when he saw it clearly. A puppy. Small, skinny, maybe 6 months old, with patches of fur missing from its sides and one leg dragging behind awkwardly. Its coat, what was left of it, was a mix of tan and white, smudged with oil and dirt. One floppy ear stuck straight up while the other hung like a wilted flower. The pup froze when it saw him, wide eyes staring with a mix of terror and exhaustion. A torn piece of rope still hung around its neck like a cruel reminder of wherever it had come from. "Well, hell," Travis muttered, crouching low but not too close. "Where'd you come from, little guy?" The puppy whimpered but didn't move. It just stood there, trembling, legs stiff as fence posts. Its ribs poked through its sides like someone had drawn them with chalk. Travis could see a sore on its front paw, raw and swollen. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the half-eaten beef jerky he always kept for long drives. Slowly, he peeled off a piece and held it out. "Come on now," he said softly, keeping his voice low and even. "Ain't gonna hurt you." The wind gusted again, and the puppy flinched, taking a shaky step back. Then, after a long pause, it sniffed the air and took one step forward. Then another. A low whine escaped its throat as it limped closer, head low, body hunched. It was maybe 5 feet away now. Travis didn't move. Finally, the pup reached the jerky, took it with trembling jaws, and backed away again. It chewed slowly, eyes never leaving his. "Well, look at that," Travis murmured. "We're makin' progress." He knelt, inching forward just a little, and extended the rest of the jerky in an open palm. The puppy hesitated but didn't run. After another moment, it limped close enough to touch. And when it finally laid its head against Travis's hand, something in his chest shifted. Not much. Just enough to notice. Travis stayed kneeling beside the pup, letting the wind whistle quietly between them. He didn't say much, didn't need to. Out here, words had less weight than patience. The puppy, still trembling, leaned slightly into his hand. Its fur was coarse, sticky in places, and smelled like motor oil and desperation. "All right," Travis muttered, "let's see if you'll ride shotgun." Moving slowly, he stood up and opened the truck's passenger door. The puppy flinched at the creak of the hinges but didn't bolt. Travis walked back to it, crouched again, and this time gently slid both hands under its chest and hindquarters. The dog yelped, high and sharp. "Easy now," he said, tightening his grip but keeping his voice calm. "Ain't tryin' to hurt you." The puppy squirmed weakly, too tired to fight, and Travis lifted it into his arms. It was lighter than it should have been, barely over 15 pounds, if that. For a beagle mix, it felt more like bones wrapped in burlap. He carried it to the truck and set it gently on the torn passenger seat, adjusting the flannel jacket he kept there into a makeshift cushion. The pup curled into a tight ball, nose tucked under its tail. Travis closed the door, rounded the front of the truck, and climbed in behind the wheel. He glanced over at the little form, now watching him with glassy, unsure eyes. "You better not puke on that seat," he muttered. "Only got one of those." The engine rumbled back to life, and Travis guided the Silverado onto the road, tires spitting gravel. The dog didn't move, just kept its head low, eyes half-lidded. 15 minutes later, they rolled into the outskirts of Pine Hollow. The town hadn't changed much in 30 years, same faded billboard reading, "Welcome to Pine Hollow, a good place to rest," same gas station with one working pump, same two-lane main street lined with dusty storefronts and chipped benches. Travis pulled into the gravel lot behind his auto repair shop. The building was a squat cinder block structure painted a color that might have once been blue. A faded sign above the bay doors read, "Hales Auto and Diesel." He stepped out, opened the passenger door, and stared down at the pup. It stared back. "You comin' or we doin' this the hard way?" he asked. The dog didn't move. Travis stood there a minute, then sighed and reached in. This time, the pup didn't resist. He carried it inside and laid it gently on an old dog bed he'd kept for years in the corner, leftover from a stray that never stayed. The bell over the front door jingled. "Travis," a voice called. It was Joan from the diner next door, holding a to-go cup of coffee. She stopped in the doorway when she saw the pup on the floor. "Oh my lord, what happened to that poor thing?" "Found him on the highway. Barely walkin', dot." "He yours?" Travis hesitated. "Not exactly." Joan raised an eyebrow. "He's on your bed. He's just restin', dot." She handed him the coffee, gave him a look that said she wasn't buying it, and left with a knowing smirk. Travis looked down at the pup again, now curled into a tight ball, eyes closed. "Not mine," he muttered to himself. But his tone lacked conviction. Word traveled fast in Pine Hollow. By the time Travis flipped the "closed" sign on his shop door and came back in with a sack of kibble from the gas station, the news had already made its rounds. Folks in small towns didn't need Twitter to spread a story. They had diner booths, gas pumps, and one hell of a phone tree. The next morning, Travis walked into the shop carrying his usual thermos of coffee, expecting to get a few oil changes done before lunch. What he got instead was a full parking lot and a half-dozen familiar faces pressed against the bay window, peering in like it was the front of a zoo exhibit. "I heard he's got a hound that eats chicken bones straight out the trash," old Mr. Gillis said, face nearly flattened against the glass. "I heard it's half coyote," Marla from the bakery added, sipping from a styrofoam cup. Travis unlocked the door with a groan. "Y'all ever consider hobbies that don't involve my business?" Inside, the pup, still unnamed, was curled up in the dog bed beside the heater. Travis had managed to get a few bites of kibble and half a scrambled egg into him overnight. He was still skittish, but when Travis entered, his tail thumped once, slow and unsure. "See that?" Marla whispered, pointing. "He likes you." Travis rolled his eyes. "He's hungry. So was I after a gas station burrito, doesn't mean I'm gonna marry the clerk." The bell jingled again. This time, it was Meredith Scott, Pine Hollow's only veterinarian. She came in holding a small med kit and wearing her standard fleece vest with paw prints embroidered on the chest. She glanced down at the dog. "So, you planning on pretending he just followed you home forever, or are you gonna admit you're keeping him?" "I'm not keeping him," Travis said automatically. "Sure," Meredith said, kneeling beside the pup and examining his leg. "And I'm not charging you for this checkup either." Travis didn't answer. He watched her fingers gently press around the pup's injured paw, the way her voice dropped to a whisper when she told him, "It's okay, sweetheart." "Is he gonna make it?" Travis finally asked. Meredith looked up. "If we keep infection away, give him time and food, he'll be all right." "But he's been through something, Travis. This isn't just some lost farm dog." Travis scratched the back of his neck. "I kinda figured." "You got a leash?" He snorted. "Lady, I barely got cable." She handed him one from her bag, a faded red one with chew marks at the end. "Now you do." As she stood, Meredith gave him a half smile. "You ever think maybe you didn't find him by accident?" Travis looked at the pup, who was now watching him with those round, uncertain eyes. "I think I found a headache." But his voice was softer than before. Outside, the crowd had mostly wandered off. Word was, Travis Hale had taken in a beat-up little mutt. Some thought it was crazy. Others said it was about time someone like him had company again. The dog didn't know any of that, of course. But when Travis sat down on the floor beside him and didn't say a word, the puppy leaned in, just a little. And that was more than enough for now. Meredith's clinic sat just off Main Street, wedged between the feed store and the town's only barber shop, which still had a sign advertising $2 cuts from 1987. The building was small but tidy, with a hand-painted sign that read Pine Hollow Veterinary Care swinging gently in the Wyoming wind. Inside, the air smelled like disinfectant and peanut butter dog treats. Travis stood awkwardly in the lobby, holding the pup like it might fall apart in his arms. The dog didn't move much, just rested its head against his chest, eyes half shut but still alert. "Bring him back here," Meredith called, motioning toward the exam room. Travis followed her in and gently set the dog on the steel table. The pup gave a weak whimper, more out of habit than pain, and curled its tail protectively around its body. Meredith pulled on a pair of gloves and adjusted the overhead lamp. Her movements were calm, practiced. She started by brushing back the fur gently, inspecting the raw patches and small scabs along the pup's side. "Poor baby," she whispered, almost to herself. "He's been through hell." Travis stood off to the side, arms folded, jaw tight. Meredith pressed a stethoscope to the pup's chest, then checked his eyes, ears, and mouth. Her brows drew closer with every pass. "He's underweight, by a lot. I'd guess he's around 15 pounds, and he should be over 20. That's not just bad luck. That's long-term neglect." She carefully lifted one paw. Around the wrist was a nearly healed rope burn, thin and pink like a scar that had once been raw. "See that?" she said. "That's not from a leash. That's from being tied up for too long, too tight. Travis looked down at the dog, then quickly away. Someone left him out there? Worse, Meredith said. Someone owned him. Then tossed him like garbage. She moved to the hind leg, the one that dragged, and pressed gently. The pup yelped. Meredith sighed. Old break. It healed wrong. I'd bet it happened months ago. And he never saw a vet. Whoever had him didn't care. They just let it heal crooked. Travis didn't say anything. He just stared at the dog, who now stared back at him. Still think he's not yours? Meredith asked gently. Travis didn't answer. He just looked down, brow furrowed, and the silence said more than any words could. Meredith moved with a quiet urgency now, pulling supplies from a nearby cabinet, gauze, ointment, a syringe. She cleaned the raw spots carefully, murmuring soft words as the puppy flinched at each touch. Travis stood by the wall, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, pretending not to watch too closely. The pup never growled, never snapped. Just stared ahead with those tired eyes and took the pain like it was something he'd come to expect. He's tough, Meredith said. But he's been alone a long time. She prepared a small injection. Antibiotics, she explained. Prevent infection. He's got open wounds and that leg's a mess. Won't fix the old break, but it'll ease the swelling. Travis nodded once, silently. Meredith wrapped the leg in a soft bandage and tucked the pup gently into a blanket she'd pulled from a drawer. The dog gave a faint sigh, a small release, like it finally understood it didn't have to be on guard. He let you carry him, Meredith said, glancing over. That says something. Travis gave a quiet grunt. He was too tired to fight. Or maybe he knew. Knew what? That you weren't gonna hurt him. The room settled into a quiet stillness. The heater kicked on, rattling faintly, and the dog blinked slowly, resting its head on the table. I'm not exactly pet material, Travis muttered. I don't have a fenced yard. I don't do walks. And I don't even own a leash. Meredith reached into her supply drawer and tossed something at him. A faded red leash, frayed at the edges. There, she said. Now you do. Travis looked at it in his hands, then at the bundle of fur on the table. What, you think I'm supposed to take him home? I think he already decided that. The dog stirred slightly at the sound of his voice, lifting its head and gazing at him. Then, slowly, it reached out its muzzle and rested it on the edge of the table closest to Travis. Meredith smiled softly. Sometimes, they choose us before we even know we're ready. Travis scratched the back of his neck, then sighed. Fine, he muttered. But it's temporary. Just until he's strong enough to walk. Sure it is, Meredith said, smirking as she cleaned up. But they both knew better. And so did the dog. That night, the Wyoming wind came howling down from the hills like a freight train with no brakes. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since sunset, and snow was starting to fall in scattered, angry bursts. Travis had just finished boarding up the loose panel on the shop's rear door when he noticed the lights flicker. He glanced at the heater in the corner. It hummed like it always did, old, loud, and reliable. Still, something about the way the wind shook the siding made his gut feel tight. Storms like this didn't come out of nowhere in April, unless they did. Inside, the puppy, still unnamed, was curled up in the same flannel jacket Travis had wrapped him in the first night. He hadn't moved much all day, but he'd eaten a full bowl of kibble, and his eyes had lost that faraway glaze. There was something sharper in his gaze now, something alive. Watching. Travis sat down at his kitchen table with a sandwich and a half-empty can of beans. The radio buzzed low with static and a few half-sung lines from a Johnny Cash song before cutting out completely. He tapped it. Nothing. The wind kicked harder. Snow tapped the window like someone trying to get in. Travis chewed in silence, trying to ignore the ache in his lower back and the strange feeling building in his chest. It wasn't worry exactly. It was more like a weight. Something pressing down, just beneath the surface. He'd nearly dozed off in the recliner when the barking started. Sharp. Loud. Urgent. The puppy, who hadn't made a sound in 2 days, was now standing, wobbly but upright, growling low and barking toward the kitchen. Travis sat up straight. What the hell's gotten into you? Then he smelled it. A sharp, acrid bite in the air. Faint, but real. Gas. He rushed to the kitchen and swung open the cabinet beneath the old propane heater. The line, patched a dozen times over the years, had come loose. A hiss of gas whispered into the room, growing stronger by the second. Damn, Travis muttered, grabbing a wrench and cutting off the valve. The sound stopped, but the air already smelled dangerous. He threw open 2 windows and stepped outside into the cold night, dragging the pup with him, wrapped in a blanket. Minutes later, the fire department arrived, lights flashing red against the snow. You're lucky, one of them said. Could have gone up in flames. You got a carbon monoxide detector? Travis shook his head. Well then, the firefighter added, nodding toward the pup in Travis's arms, guess you owe that little guy your life. Travis looked down at the puppy, now calm again, curled into his chest. For the first time, he didn't say anything smart. He just held the dog tighter, as the snow kept falling around them. The snow had stopped by morning, but the air was still thick with smoke from the propane leak. Travis stood in the wreckage of his back porch, staring at the scorched wood that had been blackened when the gas ignited from a spark in the old furnace wiring. The explosion hadn't been huge, but it was enough to tear apart the back steps and blow out a window. A few more minutes inside and it would have taken the whole place, and him, with it. He hadn't slept. The firemen had cleared out around 3 a.m., and the wind had quieted some by dawn. Travis sat on the floor with a coffee he hadn't touched, the puppy lying quietly in his lap. For once, he didn't bother pretending the dog wasn't his. Not after that night. You knew, he said softly, scratching behind one of the dog's floppy ears. Somehow, you knew. The puppy looked up at him, brown eyes steady. There was no wag, no bark. Just calm, tired understanding. Travis let out a breath and leaned back against the wall. The room still smelled faintly like burnt insulation and adrenaline. He looked down at the blanket-wrapped pup, the red leash Meredith had given him still looped loosely around his wrist. You little son of a gun, he said. You actually saved my life. The dog blinked slowly. Later that morning, Travis stood at the hardware store's checkout counter with a new carbon monoxide detector, 2 smoke alarms, and a fire extinguisher. Behind him, the pup waited patiently in the truck, bundled in a fresh blanket. Bill, the clerk, raised an eyebrow as he rang up the items. Never thought I'd see the day. Hale buying fire safety gear? Yeah, well, Travis muttered, had a wake-up call last night. Bill scanned the last item, then leaned forward with a half-smirk. That about that dog everyone's talking about? Travis hesitated, then nodded once. He's got a name now. Oh yeah? What did you go with? Travis paused. Miracle, he said. Bill's smile softened. Well, ain't that something? Back at the shop, Travis opened the passenger door and helped the pup down gently. He didn't limp as badly anymore, still sore, but moving with more confidence. Travis looked down at him, hand still resting on the leash. Miracle, he said again, like testing the word. The pup's ears perked slightly. It fit. Inside, the heater had been replaced, the broken glass swept up, and the blanket bed refluffed. Travis pulled out 2 bowls, one for water, one for a generous helping of scrambled eggs and kibble. Miracle sat near his side the whole time, watching him work. This wasn't temporary anymore. Not even close. Spring crept back into Wyoming like a cautious guest, slow and unsure. The snow melted in lazy patches across the hills, revealing flattened grass and muddy tracks. The air was still cool, but the sun stayed out longer now, stretching golden fingers across the town each afternoon. In Pine Hollow, life moved at its usual rhythm, slow, steady, familiar. But inside Hale's auto and diesel, things had changed. Miracle had carved out a space in Travis's world, quietly but completely. Every morning, he greeted Travis with a tail wag and a soft whine, never loud, never pushy. He still limped a little, but it was less noticeable now. Meredith had replaced his splint with a brace, and he was building strength back in that crooked leg. He moved with more confidence each day, even managing to hop into the truck bed on his own by week 3. Travis had rigged up an old doghouse in the corner of the shop, insulated it with leftover foam from a cooler repair job, even added a strip of weather sealant around the base. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, and Miracle seemed to like it better than the house anyway. Probably because Travis spent most of his time in the garage too. They had their routine down to a science. Travis would roll up the garage door around 7:30, Miracle trotting beside him. He'd eat breakfast, usually eggs and bacon, sometimes a few bites shared with his four-legged shadow, then start in on whatever cars were lined up for the day. Miracle would curl up near the space heater when it was cold or stretch out by the door when the sun was strong. He didn't bark much, didn't make a fuss. Just watched. Always watching. And when customers came by, they noticed. "That your dog now, Travis?" old Mrs. Jensen asked as she waited for her oil change. Travis didn't even hesitate anymore. "Yep." "What's his name?" "Miracle." She blinked, then smiled wide. "That's about right." In the evenings, Travis took him on short walks down by the creek that ran behind the shop. The dog didn't wander far, always circling back like he was checking to make sure Travis was still there. They'd sit under the cottonwood trees while the sun dipped low, a quiet calm settling between them. Sometimes Meredith would join them, a coffee in one hand and a tennis ball in the other. Miracle had started fetching, sort of. He'd chase the ball with enthusiasm but rarely brought it back. Meredith laughed every time. "He's got spirit," she'd say. "Stubborn, too," Travis added, but he always said it with a grin. Little by little, the hole in Travis's life that he never talked about had started to fill. Not with noise or chaos, but with quiet company, steady presence, and warm eyes that asked for nothing but gave everything back. He didn't say much about it. Didn't need to. The way he looked at that dog told the whole story. By late spring, the town had settled into its usual rhythm. Graduation banners hung over Main Street, the scent of fresh soil filled the air, and the days stretched longer with every passing week. But for Travis Hale, life had taken a turn he hadn't expected. Not just because of Miracle, though the dog had clearly become the heart of his daily routine, but because, for the first time in years, Travis was looking outward again. It started small. A few weeks after the gas leak incident, a kid from the high school dropped by the shop holding a skinny black mutt that looked like it had crawled through a briar patch and a dumpster in the same day. "She followed me from the train yard," the boy said, sheepish. "Dad says we can't keep her." Travis looked at the dog, fleas, ribs showing, limping. He glanced at Miracle, who was lying in his usual spot by the heater. Miracle raised his head, sniffed the air, and thumped his tail once. "Well," Travis said, scratching his beard, "I reckon we got room for one more." Word spread quick after that. Within a month, Travis had 3 strays rotating through the back of his shop. Meredith helped him set up a fenced pen using old pallets and chicken wire, and the feed store started giving him expired dog food for free. Folks dropped off blankets. Someone donated 2 plastic dog igloos that now sat under the overhang behind the garage like tiny domes of second chances. He didn't call it a rescue. He didn't give it a name or start a GoFundMe. That wasn't Travis's style. But people knew. They saw the changes in him. They saw how he talked a little more. Laughed a little easier. How he sat out front with Miracle every evening, sipping coffee and watching the other dogs nap in the sun. "Guess this is what retirement looks like," he joked one night, tossing a tennis ball lazily across the gravel. "You're 43, Meredith said, rolling her eyes. "Early retirement." She smirked. "You ever think about doing this for real? Starting a proper rescue?" Travis leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under him. Miracle rested his head on Travis's boot, eyes half closed. "I never planned on saving anything," Travis said. "But I guess when something small and beat up looks at you like you're worth staying alive for, it kinda changes things." Meredith was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah. It does." The sun dipped behind the hills, casting the town in a warm amber light. A breeze moved through the cottonwoods, and the scent of dust and lilacs carried on the air. Travis reached down and scratched Miracle behind the ear. "You broke my porch," he said quietly. "And fixed my life." The dog gave a contented sigh. Some stories don't start with a plan. They start with a moment. A limp. A look. And one little life that refuses to give up. Turns out, that's all it takes to change everything.